You're listening to Breakpoint This Week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Today we're going to talk about the financial upheaval in the markets on Monday. What does it mean to find our safety in the Lord and not money? We're also going to talk about Vice President Kamala Harris's pick for her vice presidential candidate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. And what does a person's life philosophy have to do with the way that they govern? We have a lot to get to today. We're so glad you're with us. Stick around. Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. Speaking of presidents, John, I've been wanting to ask you this all week. Do we have a president?
Oh, come on. Are we going to start that way?
I'm really anxious about this, actually. So this week, there was a lot of, I guess it's cliche to say this, but there was a lot of news that made people anxious, which is the understatement of the century.
You know, when we say this is not a political podcast, starting that way and then going into our first topic, people aren't going to believe that at all.
I know. Everything.
You're ruining our brand is what I'm saying.
The personal is political, John.
It's not. It shouldn't be. But you know, on a Worldview take, which this is a Worldview podcast, I've said this a couple times, but this is proof, so I'm going to use it again.
Let's hear it.
There is, when everything is about politics, it says a lot more about the cultural moment than it does about politics. When politics sucks all the air out of the room, when things that shouldn't be politically motivated or driven or anything like that are, then it says that politics is playing an outsized role in a culture, and that the other things, the extra political realities, the mediating institutions that Chuck Colson talked about, quoting Edmund Burke, of family and church and Boy Scouts and all the other, extra political local organizations that are virtue forming, that are habit forming, that are really important for a citizenry. It means that they're far less important than they should be. And politics is far more important than it should be. But of course, we're in election year. What do you expect?
Yes, except I do expect to have a president, and I'm just not sure. I just feel anxious about it.
So you're going back to the fact that it's just not clear.
It's just unclear.
Okay.
And
fair enough.
This week, there was even more reason to be concerned about that, I would say. So one of our best friends, they live in Phoenix, and he is an investment banker. So I was texting with him on Monday morning, and he said, I haven't seen this much red on my screen since 2020. March of 2020. And I'm not an investment banker, but that does not sound good to me. And I was seeing the news reports and hearing about the market crashing first in Japan and then maybe here. And then it was unsettling. When I was talking to you about this yesterday briefly, and we thought we would talk about it on the show today, all you said was, I'm not looking at my accounts. And I thought that's probably the best way to do it. I probably won't look at mine either. Is this a real problem? What is going on?
Well, you're talking about what happened on Monday, and
yeah.
it certainly got my attention, but it got everybody's attention. And you know, watching what became a pretty significant drop in the Dow, pretty significant drop in the Nasdaq, it just smelled to me like the economic realities that were behind it were being kind of overshadowed by something bigger, something cultural. First of all, the panic. There is an outsized panic that happens here. And as I learned when I had a conversation, what happened on Monday, despite it being called historic, despite it being reported as if it perhaps was signaling something incredibly dire for the long term, without any sort of context of the history of the market and the kind of swings that it tends to take, particularly when a particular segment of the market gets inflated. This one doesn't even hit the top 100, is what I learned later. That's pretty significant. It's historic in the fact that, you know, as the day settled out, despite what your friend said about 2020, the last time something like this happened was actually 2022. That's not that long ago, you know? It was kind of like when I went through the assassination attempts on presidents and presidential candidates. And what happened in Pennsylvania at the Trump rally was horrific and terrible. And what we're seeing is absolutely ridiculous in terms of the failure of the Secret Service. I mean, it's just becoming more and more and more clear. But it wasn't unprecedented. And throwing out that word unprecedented In fact, that ended the longest streak we'd had without an assassination attempt since Lincoln. So that's sometimes it's just helpful to put it into perspective. But it seemed to me that there was at least a couple things. Number one is immediately people went and blamed both presidential candidates. This is on Trump. This is on Kamala.
You're talking about financial.
I'm talking about the financial news now, not the assassination. Right. Yeah, I'm going back to Monday. When the news broke, immediately people made it political. It goes toward the point we just made. This markets aren't completely impervious to political realities at all. There is a bump based on, seeing the future in terms of who's going to win and the certain policies that are going to be implemented, and it certainly affects more sectors than others. But it's remarkably impervious to political realities. There's kind of no baloney thing that these things, the economic realities, take. When presidents or presidential candidates either take credit or blame another side for it, they're overstating the case. That's just always the case. President Trump this week claimed to be able to control interest rates, or that the president should control interest rates. This would be a terrible thing. It's terrible enough that the Feds do it. The Federal Reserve does. I mean, a president should do it? No, absolutely not. That's crazy. And the other thing that I saw was, again, the panic and the fear. And I've really been thinking a lot about this, that in a time of cultural uncertainty, there are a lot of sources of fear. And yet that basic truth of Scripture is that the fear of the Lord casts out all other fears. What does that actually mean? What does that actually mean in cultural uncertainty? I think it's talking more about cultural and personal uncertainty than it is, some sort of spiritual reality of being afraid of, the enemy or demons or something like that. Mm-hmm. There really is something about economic realities that reveals, okay, where do we put our trust? Where do we put our faith? There's a reason Jesus said you can't trust both God and mammon. Mammon not being really money, but sources of security, mostly financial security. So I had a conversation, called an audible real quick this week, and I've been really thankful and helped by David Bahnsen. Bahnsen, who's the founder and president of the Bahnsen Group, is an investment firm, but does a lot of writing and speaking and thinking around the intersections of faith and economics. Does it from, I think, a pretty strong worldview perspective. Has a long history and family history, at least in theology. And so we had a conversation, and I want to play a little bit of that conversation because specifically he addressed kind of the limits of understanding things that happen on like what happened on Monday through the headlines, the topic of fear and how that connects to the fear of the Lord, and what, and also I thought too, seeing things for what they really are, which was really helpful because, again, remember we talked about this so many times that when Jesus was asked a question about marriage, he went back to creation. When Jesus is asked, or speaks at the Sermon on the Mount about kind of the uncertainties of culture, and he basically wants to plant our feet into trusting the Lord, he again goes back to creational realities. Look at what he's done for the lilies of the field. Look what he's done for the birds. If he feeds them, is he going to feed you? That's the sort of thing that he points to. And I think there's real implications there for how we think and how we see. And somebody who knew what was happening, David had written a terrific piece for World Opinions, being really clear. Hey, here's what happened on Monday. Here's what it means. Here's what it doesn't mean. And we had a great conversation. So I wanted to play a bit of that conversation here on Breakpoint this week. In World Opinions, you identified, three very clear factors that were behind what was a pretty dramatic sell-off in the market on Monday morning. And just I wanted to chat with you, as I thought, who knows about this stuff? You were the first on my list. So first of all, thanks for agreeing to come on and talk about this.
Well, thank you for having me and for the kind words. And yeah, I think it's kind of important to note that it's really more than just Monday, because markets have gotten hit hard Thursday and Friday as well. And what I think made Monday a little more dramatic was that in the U.S. markets, it would have been the third day in a row, but that it was coming off of what to us was Sunday night, but was to Asia Monday. was Japan's market dropping 12.5% in one day. So far this week, as you and I are talking, Japan had its worst day ever since 1987 on Monday, and they had their best day ever on Tuesday, their recovery back. So that's the kind of volatility we're dealing with in global markets internationally. And so a lot of people seeing the futures Sunday night, which is night before market action that we can see and I'll spare everyone the wonky details of how that's done. I think people could have assumed that the U.S. markets looked like they were going to open down Monday because it was a follow-up of what had been going on Thursday and Friday, which were more U.S.-centric problems in the economy and in the market. But then by Monday morning, it was very clear, oh no, now what's hitting us is a follow-up from what's happening in Asia. And so that's why in World, I kind of described it as three different things, and I'm convinced I'm right about those three. But I also believe that the sequence was important, that's like in order of priority. And so number one on Monday was what's called the yen carry trade. The Japanese yen has been a very weak currency. It yields very little. Therefore, it's very cheap to borrow, and then you can go buy other things with cheap borrowed yen. And it's a way to take more risk for international investors to borrow in yen and buy other investments they may want to own. The yen rallied substantially, one of the biggest 5-day rallies against the dollar ever. And the Bank of Japan announced a small quarter-point rate hike that was unexpected. And it just caused all of these people who had borrowed to have to panic sell. So that's what we're talking about when we use terms like an unwind of a yen carry trade. You know, if I said to my wife, she just ignores it, like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I get it. The language may sound a little bit mysterious, but that's what we're talking about is a whole lot of people, hundreds of billions of dollars, were caught off sides by borrowing in the Japanese currency and having to panic sell. That's the primary driver of Monday. However, it took place in the same course of the U.S. markets already having started to correct in the NASDAQ, our big tech companies. Some of these that have had a big move up lately, like NVIDIA and Microsoft. The NASDAQ had actually been going down since July 10th. So it had been almost 3-4 weeks already. And as of Monday, the NASDAQ was down 13.5% from its high. And so it was a kind of secondary story. It's one I believe, and I'm quite on record as saying, very likely has a long way to go. It could very well rally like it has the last couple of days since Monday. It's going to be up and down, but we just have way overdone this AI story, this artificial intelligence mania. And I think there's a lot more correction to potentially come out of these overvalued tech stocks. And then it leaves us with the third thing, John, which is the economy. Is just essentially markets have been in a pretty good wave for a long time of knowing that the Fed was basically done raising rates. It's been over a year. It was July of last summer when they last raised rates, and yet that the economy had not gone into recession. Now we have known for some time that we're getting closer and closer to the Fed cutting rates, and we still never really saw unemployment go up that much. Credit conditions tighten too much, not a lot of economic deterioration. So it's what we call Goldilocks, this sort of not too hot, not too cold, everything kind of worked out. Well, now people are worried, okay, the economy is slowing a little bit. Maybe it's not recessionary, but you had a really bad jobs report on Friday. And it wasn't a great one the month before either. So now the narrative gets into markets of maybe the economy is slowing going into next year. Our tech sector is overvalued, and it's the last thing we need is to have this yen carry trade going on. All of those things converged into about a 24-hour period.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think was really helpful is that this is three factors. You don't get quite the panic without all three factors kind of showing up at the same time. A little bit of a perfect storm. But on the worldview side of this, especially from a Christian worldview perspective, there were two things in particular that I thought were really helpful. The hyper politicization, everything being about politics. Obviously everyone went to Twitter or X now, the source of all truth in the Western world, and proclaimed this is Trump's fault, this is Kamala's fault, immediately going to these political reasons. You came out and said, it's not either one of them. To what degree can we blame it on either political party at this point?
Well, let's answer it two different ways. First, how can we blame this volatility, these big sell-offs and big rallies on the political side? The answer is not at all. Not like 10%, 5%, 20%. I mean 0%. Now, by the way, it's self-evident. Are we to believe markets dropped 1,000 points Monday because we were afraid of Kamala Harris, and it went up 1,000 points Tuesday because we weren't afraid of Kamala Harris? And then it's not related on up and down movement to politics. It's an incoherent idea. But even when you get rid of the volatility of it, then the more deep issue of, well, this candidate's good for the market, this candidate's bad for the market, I would argue there can be some truth in that. Markets like tax cuts and markets like deregulation and markets like a pro-business agenda, whatever that may look like. Let's say I had a crystal ball and knew that a certain candidate was going to win who wanted to increase export of liquefied natural gas. Then I think that sector could start to price some of those things in. But even then, you need Senate approval because there's committees and other technicalities in American form of government. So just as there's nuance in our civics, there's nuance in our markets.
And there's realities about the human condition. And you've written about that in a new book called Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. And I want to get to that here in a second, because I think a lot of times, and this goes to the second thing that I think really made me want to have this conversation right now. It had been a while since the economic news or a particular event like what happened, as you described it, these three factors coming out emerging over the weekend, kind of hitting this perfect storm, created the level of panic. I mean, there's a lot of panic on Monday. And of course, a lot of that panic comes, maybe not with you. You were probably, sitting back saying, okay, how do I navigate this? But for the average person, a lot of people check their retirement accounts. Bad idea to do on Monday, right? And a lot of people watch the news. Another bad idea to do on Monday when, the panicked headlines about this unprecedented sell-off. And I appreciated a handful of commentaries, National Review, some others that, just clarified, look, this, the last time this happened was 2022. It really wasn't that far ago, at least percentage-wise.
And it's not in the top 100.
That's an important point.
Not even in the top
100.
Even not in the top 10 is important, but not in the top 100. And so it's funny. My 14-year-old son, who's my youngest, he was saying, Dad, market down 1,000 points, is this the worst, whatever? And I was talking to him about the market was down 777 points in September 2008, and that was significantly worse. And he said, well, what do you mean? It's over 1,000 today. And I said, let's do a little math. If we're down 777 points when the Dow was at 10,000, you're talking about 7 or 8%. And if you're talking about being down 1,000 points when the Dow's at 40,000, you're talking about 2 to 2.5%, right? And that's forgotten too. And the media wants it to be forgotten because I admit the drama of saying 1,000 points is much better than saying 2%.
Yeah. And it's that fear aspect that I think has to speak to us as followers of Christ, right? I mean, when Scripture says that fear of the Lord casts out all other fear, that's got to include economic fears. And, this emerges too. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of it has to do with getting past the hype and getting to the realities of the market, the realities of the numbers, like you said, and also then just what are we required to believe and think as followers of Christ in relation to kind of fears of the market? Yeah,
well, it's not my view that Christians necessarily have to be in the market. I do believe Christians' investment plans and parable of the talents principles should mean that they're invested in human productivity. And so I am a big fan in trying to tether our future investment to our God-created capacity for co-creation and productivity and innovation. And it is true that that generally takes the form and risk-taking of things that are more equity-like than defensive. But that's a broader conversation maybe for another day. But yes, the general framework you're describing, I think, is very important sociologically. Whether it's fear of a market sell-off or fear of a political election outcome, the general framework of Christians living in fear and despair is unacceptable in a biblical worldview. And fear not is the commandment repeated most in Scripture. Out of every other commandment, being told not to be afraid. Now, that doesn't mean you should go stand in the middle of a railroad track and not be afraid, but however, I do think it's important when you have a perspective, a sort of sober judgment that comes from the Christian understanding of God's sovereignty, of control, of when you have sensible plans in place, understanding that there's unpredictabilities in the world that are going to come up and that those things don't dislodge us. And so I don't want to be guilty of taking biblical language and biblical concepts and misapplying them to a bad portfolio. People who have a bad portfolio should try to get a good portfolio. And that, again, that's a whole other conversation. But yes, good plans, good portfolios, our general plans that we do in life are always subject to unpredictable things, and we should not be undone in fear in those moments.
You just heard part of a conversation between John and David Bahnsen of the Bahnsen Group. We're actually going to release the full conversation that they had next week on a bonus podcast, so watch this podcast feed for that. Breakpoint this week is not a political podcast. So, John, I want to turn now to Tim Walz. He is... Vice President Harris chose the Minnesota governor, Tim Walz, to be her running mate this week. We don't need to talk about this from a political perspective, but it is important what his policy views are and what his worldview is. And I will just say one of the things I've been struck by this week in watching this news unfold is how little we seem to care culturally what people's actual policies are. I don't think Vice President Harris has had a press conference yet since her candidacy has been announced, where she's answered questions about policy. I saw this morning that she does not have a policy section on her website. A lot of, I don't mean to be tongue-in-cheek here, but a lot of our politics around this presidential race seem to be based on vibes. And I find that really disconcerting in the same way that I feel anxious about not knowing if we have a competent president right now. Because if you look, a lot of the coverage about Tim Walz as the Minnesota governor and now the VP pick under Harris is about, just what he seems like. He seems like a cool, quirky dad, and we're going to make lots of cheeky jokes about how he's just a regular dude and he's cool and we like him. And this goes back to the whole, he seems like somebody I could have a beer with kind of thing that people used to say about Obama. And it feels icky to me on a couple levels. First is that it feels like whenever something like this happens, like the notes go out to everybody and suddenly these are the talking points, and every progressive person you'll hear some version of the same thing, which is that he's just he was a football coach and he taught math or whatever. And he's, he was for school lunches and he's a cool guy. And something about that just is eerie to me. But drilling down into some of his policies, they are incredibly progressive. That's what we'd expect from somebody that Vice President Harris picks to be her running mate. But especially on things like transgender issues, including parental rights, on abortion, on economics. What do you think about this pick?
Yeah, I think there's a couple aspects to it. I think the policy positions are obviously the ones we want to get to, and there's a little bit of a lack of clarity, as you said. And, as we spent a lot of time on this with President Trump and the vice presidential nominee on the Republican side, J.D. Vance, and the move of the Republican platform and the role that President Trump had in the move away from very clear pro-life language, from historic pro-life commitments, and also moving on definitions of the family. And, look, this is clearly a calculated move, thinking that in order to pull some folks from the middle, there's going to, and win some of these swing states, that they're going to have to tone down the rhetoric on abortion, and they're going to have to tone down the rhetoric on, kind of the historic social conservative issues. Problem is that you can't be a conservative if you don't have things to conserve, and you can't be a conservative if you don't have the right things to conserve. And there's nothing more fundamentally right than this definition of the human person and protecting the dignity of all people, and also marriage as a pre-political institution that is a foundational bedrock of society that has a particular definition and doesn't change with the social winds. It's, as we said a number of times here, it's gravity, not a speed limit. But before we get to that on this other side and looking at kind of the worldview implications about what are the issues, it's important to say this was a interesting pick. I look, and I think the most important thing up front is why was it the governor of Minnesota, not the governor of Pennsylvania? And that sounds like a political observation up front. I don't think it is. I think it's an ideological one. The smart money was on Josh Shapiro. And the reason is because Pennsylvania is winnable and Pennsylvania is necessary for the Harris campaign. The calculation here is that it's going to cause a problem with the far left side of the party because of, really, is this pointing to, and I think this is a legitimate question. Now, by the way, not just a question I'm asking, not just a question, some folks who are conspiratorial are asking. Jake Tapper asked this in pretty uncertain terms on CNN. Is this reflecting the deeper anti-Semitism that the Dems have a problem with, particularly when it comes to the current war between Israel and Gaza, and Gaza and with Hamas? Man, the smart money's not here. Now, there's some other explanations, and I want to acknowledge that. I heard one yesterday that I thought that's an interesting explanation, and that is that really the Dems have given up on this one. They don't think they can win. They're trying to mitigate the damage down ticket. And along with that, maybe, and I think there's a legitimate story here that Shapiro said no. He was asked and he said no. I don't know. There's rumors about that. No idea. That's to get into the rumors is to get into the political side of this, I think, in a way that's not helpful. I don't know. He's got a bright political future. One of the, folks at the Editors Podcast at National Review said he's better at this than she is, and so he would outshine her on the campaign trail. That's not something she's going to tolerate. Again, that's political analysis. I don't know. But I think what's obvious, Shapiro's Jewish. He was pretty clear on the campus protests, and that's not a popular thing with segments of the party. And there was a risk of bringing him on board and also dealing already with the fact that there's a lot of people grumpy with the way Biden has handled this on the far left. And I again, is this another area in which the parties are moving further and further apart? I think it's really interesting. And at the root of this is a deep anti-Semitism. Israel's right to exist and, everything that entails with the current conflict. So that to me is what's interesting. It is important to note, and it wouldn't have been much better with Shapiro than with the choice that was made. But the policies here on abortion, the policies here on marriage, the policies here on pushing trans ideology through schools, that stuff, we've never seen a ticket like this. This is the most, radical anti-child ticket that we have ever seen. Mm-hmm. And I know this week you brought attention to, and I've been talking with Katy Faust, who's putting this book together, and it's coming up here in a couple weeks is when it's being released. Katy Faust, of course, the founder of Them Before Us. She's guest hosted. She sat in for you when you were, and I know she typically listens. So, hey, Katy, is putting together a pro-child policy book. In other words, what if we rethought all of our policy along this line of this framework that she's given us, which is kids before adults? Like, we put the rights and well-being of kids before us. And how would that play out? Well, listen, I can't imagine. And again, the temptation is to look at this and say, okay, this is just, policy stuff, politics stuff, an excuse to go right, excuse to go conservative. No, listen, it's not even close right now. And particularly with this ticket and what we do know that this governor has done he brags about Nancy Pelosi telling him to calm down on his pro-abortion rhetoric. And again, how relevant actually are the vice presidents? Both of the vice presidential candidates right now are getting way more attention than they, than
right.
What is merited, based on the role that the vice president plays. I always go back to Hamilton, on this. There's that line in Hamilton when Hamilton's wife is trying to, get him to take the summer off, and he says, hey, John Adams takes the summer off. And he's like, John Adams doesn't have a real job. The vice president is not really a thing. That's not exactly true. Okay. It's a funny line, but it's not exactly true. But there's far more attention being leveled here. And I want to be mindful of that. But Harris is not a policy candidate,
Yeah.
There's an ideological commitment that will then be carried out through the sort of policy things that, someone who's been a governor versus someone who's been a senator is going to look really different. And so I don't want to give too much attention, but at the same time, this was the choice, and it matters, and it does reflect some things, I think.
Well, I want to ask you about that because so you're saying she's not a policy wonk. Noted. I had no idea. I thought she was a deep policy wonk. But the question I have is, has it always been this way where, and maybe this is a function of how large our government has become, which is also like a fair function of how big the country, we have a huge country. We have a very big population. The government is a large entity and growing larger by the day and has its hand in a lot of parts of life. So it's not exactly simple or feasible to get up on a stage and say, here's what I would do in each area of my influence as a president. But has it been like this for long? This feels to me like new or newer, how little we care about the policies or about even just talking about political philosophy or philosophy in general. There just seems to be, and I feel like I want to be fair that this has happened on the right and the left. There was a lot when Trump was kind of ascending before 2016 and everybody was kind of understandably unsure about where he stood because he has a very mixed path. I mean, he was a dear friend of the Clintons, right? And he was this kind of symbol of like decadence, and he was a media guy. He had very famous reality TV show. And so it was kind of unclear, like, who is this? What is his worldview and how does he look at the world? And there was less conversation about the details of that than there was about just his personality and what he would bring to the office and how he would approach, discussions with others. It feels the same way this time around. And to a degree that it's making me anxious, which maybe is the theme of this week's program, because I have no idea. You're starting to sense that even these people on the ticket, like, did they even know what their policies would be? Did they understand the questions before them? Or is this all about, getting out something in 140 characters that will be retweeted and sound cool, and get the Hollywood stars to post an Instagram about it,
Well, look, I don't think there's any doubt that times have changed. I mean, you only need to go back to the Lincoln Douglas debates.
Right.
And that went for 3 hours at a time. That's what the debates look like. And they were long and they were detailed and so on.
I think I read something about that recently where they each got like 20 minutes each question to start their answer.
No,
like,
it was a different day, and it was moderated differently, and there wasn't the TV. And look, Lincoln would never be president today just because he looked weird. And the advent of TV, that's a fascinating part of Neil Postman's book about what TV has done to that. But I'm not sure it's completely accurate that people didn't know what Trump was going to do in particular. Now, was it detailed all the way across the board? No, but he highlighted 3 or 4 things that he was going to do. The website was very detailed, and the real conversation was, how is he actually going to do it? And there was a lot of cynicism and skepticism on that. So I think in terms of his backdrop and his ideological commitments, they didn't seem to always line up with the sort of things that he was promoting. His lifestyle versus his claim about life. And, we know now it was a political calculation for him to get to talk about the judges so much the first time around and to get the to get the pro-lifers behind him on that. And, the nomination of Mike Pence. I mean, these are tactical sorts of maneuvers that all politicians make in order to get this side of the, base in and not alienate this side of the base and, all that sort of stuff. So I'm not sure we didn't know what he was doing. I think his life philosophy was a little bit muddier because people were like, where did he actually come down?
I think what I mean is it seems to matter more to people how, just sort of like the aura of a person.
No, completely. No, I'm not. Yeah. And that's what I'm sorry. I can reemphasize that. But like, that's what Postman, this is a new era. It has been for a long time. And you look at the success of President Obama, there wasn't a long track record in the past, and there wasn't a whole lot of clarity exactly what it was going to do. And he didn't care. He inspired. And you just have to go to the acceptance speech in Chicago, or not the acceptance speech, but the victory speech in Chicago, and see the enthusiasm that was generated. It was something that really people hadn't seen. And you're just not going to get that same level of enthusiasm, from a John McCain or something like that. And again, I feel like we're kind of flirting around with politics, but the larger question here, I think, is very much, when we make our political decisions, based on predetermined loyalties or that aren't ideological, but that are party driven, and the loss of attention span. Just, I like that guy. I don't like that guy. That guy inspires me. That guy doesn't. That's where I think the conversation, becomes, more worldview based. You say, what are our values? So what I would say is, listen, there is this aura, this kind of vibe about it. There is the policy, and there is the thing that I think matters the most. And I think it matters the most because G.K. Chesterton said it matters the most. It's this fantastic line from Chesterton where he says, I am one of those people who still thinks that the most important thing that we need to know about someone else is their life philosophy. He says, for a woman taking in a boarder, it's important to know his income, that he can pay the rent, but even more important to know his life philosophy. And for a general going to war, it's important to know his enemy's capacity, but even more important to know his enemy's life philosophy. Mm. And he says, at the end of the day, I don't think the question is, does the life philosophy matter? But does anything else matter? I think what he was saying is at the bottom of us is the fundamental commitments that we have, the things that we think are true and real, the things that we think are worth loving and worth our time and attention, our money, our loyalties. And then from that, we'll get values, and from values, we'll get actions. And somewhere between values and actions, when you're talking about political parties and political people, then you see policy. And when the policy is not clear, because, look, too, policies are often promises that are either unachievable or basically pragmatic in the sense that once we get past the election, that priority drops from number 1 to number 500, and we'll never get around to it.
Right.
And we've seen that. I mean, I think that was the complaint by members of both political parties or voters on both sides of the political aisle for a long time. But you're right in terms of we actually have a celebrity TV star as a former president now and a presidential candidate right now. I mean, that tells you an awful lot. But to say that President Obama wasn't a celebrity is not true. Of course, he was a celebrity. He is one of the biggest celebrities in the world right now after that. So the celebrityism certainly drives it. So I think maybe one of the ways to look at this is to look at those three things and then to prioritize them in the right order. There's the aura, the vibe of a particular candidate or particular candidate, the likability factor, which obviously it seems to be most important right now. There is the policy, and then there's the life philosophy. And as much as possible, if you can get down to the worldview level, that's going to really, I think, guide and tell you, what it is that they're going to do. But there's also the reality that we talked about in a Breakpoint commentary this week, which is we still, I think, want to get away from the framework of trying to choose between the lesser of two evils and trying to choose between what will best lessen evil. And that takes the attention somewhat off the top choice on the ballot because presidents matter, but in the American context, they don't matter nearly as much as we hear. They matter a lot, but they matter a lot because of the political appointments that come along with them, judicial appointments, and also something that's been proven to be maybe the most consequential for real lives over the last, at least since President Obama's term, which are department heads. You know, I mean, look, federal departments for a long time, mired in bureaucracy, can't get anything done, can't move forward, right? Now, at least with HHS, with the Department of Justice, with our departments that administer foreign aid, they have figured out how to rewrite rules and interpretations to leverage these life philosophy commitments to get things implemented. And then they go back and forth outside of the judiciary, outside of the legislative process, and they have the effect of law. That makes these folks, 3,000 to 5,000 folks with a handful of really, really important ones, super key when it comes to evaluating which one's going to lessen evil. And again, I owe that framework, as I mentioned this week, to a former colleague at Summit Ministries. I think it's a helpful framework, and we'll link to that commentary again as we make decisions. I think we got to think through that. But look, the fact is we're not electing a king, and down ballot, state level, I think we've seen that especially on the abortion issue. This is why Christians can still lean in and get good done, if I can use that language, by caring about voting. And voting is a very minimal thing that we can do to get things done and still do that good while also not putting all of our eggs in that basket. And so I think it's really appropriate kind of as a framing of this. And I've thought about this for months and months and months, and we've worked through kind of, this, what it would be to kind of flesh out this framework of lessening evil as opposed to the lesser of two evils a little bit more. And there's a key idea, which Chuck used to say all the time, which is salvation will not come in Air Force One. And I think that's a very important truth. That's true no matter what, but it's very true of the American context, and it's very true of the American context right now. Mostly, both parties now and both campaigns are operating not in promising salvation, but in promising disaster if the other guy wins.
Yeah.
And that's a way that Jacques Ellul talked about the political illusion. And Chuck used to quote that a lot too, and I think it's more prescient now than ever. Where the political illusion was basically not just that all problems are political and all solutions are also political, but Ellul also talked about this idea that if our team wins, all is well. If the other team wins, all is lost. So I think it's really important to add something, and I did, to Chuck's quote, with great humility. Not only will salvation not come in Air Force One, but neither will the apocalypse. If the apocalypse comes, it's going to come because of all kinds of extra political realities as well. And that's the reality. And I think also we always say this, but it's really important. Christians can approach this time with a great amount of prayer for two things. Number one is that we actually fear God so that we don't fear in irrational ways, because that's what Scripture says. And somehow we got to come back to that. The fear of God casts out all other fears. So I get the anxiety part. There is a lot of anxiety, no question about it. But the fear of God casts out all other fears. Is that true or is it not? And if it is true, what does that mean for how I'm approaching the fears that come out of this election? So I think that's one thing for us to take really seriously. And then we could pray for mercy. Every election that I can remember, as I prayed for it, I pray for mercy. And that is because in the kind of system we have, we tend to get the results we deserve. And I pray that God spares us mercifully. And there's ways that he has. There's ways that, he hasn't. And, of course, judgment belongs to him, not to me. So, it's kind of like Abram, saying about Sodom, look, if there's 100, if there's 50, if there's 30, if there's 20 righteous people, you're not going to do this because you're not going to judge the righteous and unrighteous alike. The problem is he got down to 10 and there weren't 10. And the ones that were being counted, including Lot, which that's a pretty flexible definition of righteous, and the judgment came. But God went in and got the righteous out. And so there's so much about that narrative in Scripture of how God deals with nations and judgments and all that sort of stuff, that should give us hope and confidence. As Abraham basically said in his appeal to God, calling God on his own character, the judge of all the earth will do the right thing. And the judge of all the earth will do the right thing. Mm-hmm. We believe that's really real. We believe that's true. Remember Dale Tackett's question in the Truth Project. Do you believe this is really real? And I think these are the kind of moments that, man, they put this right in front of us and say, do we really believe this is really real?
Well, thanks, John. I feel like some of my anxiety is...
I was just going for some. I wasn't going for all.
Lower.
I was just trying to cut off the edges, the sharp edges.
Don't overshoot. Yes, you accomplished that. Thank you. John, I want to talk about something really quickly that I thought of last segment about, how our life philosophy influences our politics. And this is a local story here that really illustrates to me, I think, how sometimes things that we don't imagine are directly political do have real world consequences that can be really catastrophic. So over the past 2 years, there have been car thefts all over the country. There were 2 car makers who had notoriously easy to steal cars. And here in Columbus, there's been a rash of car thefts for over these 2 years. And last summer, there was a really tragic news story of a mom who went on the news and was begging the police to arrest her son. She was saying, my son will not stop stealing these cars, and I can't convince him to stop. She said, he doesn't have a dad at home. The police keep arresting him, but then they just bring him home. And he sees no consequences to these actions, and he's not going to stop, and somebody's going to get hurt. And the police, as the way that they seemed to be approaching the car thefts was a sort of this philosophy of like, well, it's kind of a victimless crime. We have an incredibly progressive city attorney, probably in a similar worldview category as someone like Kamala Harris, who was the former attorney general in California, where, we're more concerned about, the policing in terms of, racial disparities or the way that the way people view police. So we're going to be a little bit more hands off. We have many fewer police officers than we used to. They arguably have fewer resources than they used to. And so all this led to this sort of toxic soup where these thefts were just ballooning everywhere. And then fast forward to a month ago here in Columbus, this woman she's a public school teacher. She's 29 years old. She has a 6-year-old son, and she works 2 jobs. So one night she went to pick up her son after working a second shift as a waitress, and her son was at a babysitter's house. She picks him up, puts him in the back seat of her car, leaves the car running in the driveway, and goes back in to get her belongings. And 3 teenagers, I think they were 16 and 17 and 18 at the time, jump in the car and steal it. And the mom hears this happening, and she runs back out of the house and knows, of course, that her son is inside the car, jumps on the hood of the car to try to get them to stop. The kids who have stolen the car panic, and they throw her off, and she passed away. And this is one of those, just a tragedy from A to Z, but these are the sort of implications when you have a philosophy that makes you look at something like car thefts as a victimless crime, and you're taking the kids or the people that you arrest for doing it, you're just taking them home. You're thinking, well, they're just kids or whatever, and you're not teaching that there are consequences to these sorts of actions. Things escalate and people will get hurt because that's how the world works. And this illustrates to me, I think, a really important point, and we're going to move into our time of recommendations here. And I want this to be my recommendation, which is that one of the easiest, and by easy, I mean simple, uncomplicated ways to look at policy and to look at lessening evil is, how will whatever candidate or whatever policy that's before me for consideration impact the lives of kids? If we can be the people who are pro-kid, then that answers a lot of questions we have. And you might not think that it's this simple, but every policy question that's before us does impact children. It impacts them now, and it impacts the world that they'll inherit when they get older. And so that's why, we're going to move to our time of recommendations in a second here. And I've got to recommend what you mentioned earlier, which is this new book from Katy Faust. So Them Before Us is putting out this book. It comes out September 24th. It's called Pro-Child Politics. And it's such a brilliant and brilliantly simple framing of all these questions. Each chapter of the book takes a different area of either culture or policy and asks, what does it look like if we approached this from the lens of being for children, putting their needs and wants and desires and well-being before ours. How would we approach this policy or this policy? Because kids don't have lobbyists and they're not old enough to be lobbyists. So we should be the ones thinking about each time, how do our decisions impact children? I was really honored to be a part of the book. So I wrote a chapter on digital technology and how should we think about ways we implement digital technology, in particular in education and in ways that will impact kids. And this is one of the things I loved about this book, is that each chapter is not like a sort of railing against, well, we're making all these mistakes in this area. They're very practical looks at, here are some questions we should ask about this policy, and here are some pro-child ways of approaching it. So this isn't about what we're against, it's about what we're for, and we're for kids. And one of the things Katy has said about this book that I think is really brilliant is this is such a great hack for politicians. Like it's such a great, simple hack. Be the pro-child candidate. Just, and then every question that's, sorry, I can't vote to raise the debt ceiling. You know me, I'm the pro-child candidate. This is what Katy has said over and over again, which is such a helpful thing, I think, for politicians who are trying to answer questions or come up with policies in this sort of nebulous, vibe-driven world. So that's my recommendation. It's called Pro-Child Politics. It's available for pre-order right now, and pre-orders really, really help these books climb the charts. So please do pre-order it. It's available everywhere you can find books. It's called Pro-Child Politics, and the release date is September 24th. But also pre-order one for yourself and then pre-order one for your representatives and send it to them. Because again, kids don't have lobbyists, so we need to be their lobbyists. Great recommendation. My recommendation is the bonus podcast next week. The conversation with David Bahnsen went in wonderful directions, and we played a little bit of it at the beginning of the program, but it goes about 3 times that long, and there's an awful lot of ground that is covered. He's got a wonderful perspective on this. It's deeply grounded in the right life philosophy, or what we would call worldview. So that's why he gets to where he gets in his understanding of the economic framework. And our conversation went well beyond just what happened on Monday, but how do we think about this on a larger scale? Awesome. Looking forward to that. Well, that's all the time we have for our show today. Thanks so much for listening to Breakpoint this week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stone Street, president of the Colson Center, hoping we maybe raised your anxiety a little bit at the beginning of the show and then brought it right back down by the end of the show. Please join us next week. We'll see you all then.